Bailey, and this is Floral Art Review, where we use our AI and Design Eye to look at some competition designs of mine and give us an analysis based on the principles and elements of design and some suggestions for improving the design or making it a little bit closer to interpreting the class title. This week we're looking at a design that was titled Viewed from Above. And I took the approach that it's a drone view of the countryside. I thought that was the best way for me to depict it. And so what I've used is a circular baseboard, painted black, and I've sectioned it off into areas as though the drone was travelling over the countryside, so the agricultural countryside. So we've got strips of typha foliage as rows of green. Got some lentils there for other sorts of crops that might be growing, some dried moss, that's the grey part of it, some pistachio shells, some cut banksia slices and the banksia foliage that's grouped up, and then some smaller twigs and a branch that had been sliced up to give me a little bit of a change in texture and colour. Above that, suspended on some wires above the baseboard, is some fibrous material that is basically a Japanese paper, plant-based paper, that I have stripped and pulled apart a little bit, and that's to depict clouds, so that the drone is flying above these fields, seeing through the clouds to where the agriculture is below. Looking at it now, there are a few things that I would change in the design and I would refine a little bit further, but on the whole I'm happy with my interpretation and I'm keen to see how it met the principles and elements of design in terms of this analysis. At the time, the feedback from the judges was that it lacked height. Depth is what they were looking for, but depth in terms of looking down onto the design, because it was judged from above as though they were viewing it from above. So that said, let's have a look at the individual parts of the analysis along the principles and elements of design, and then what the suggestions are at the end of that analysis. So an overall impression, first of all, this intriguing design titled Viewed from Above presents a circular composition evocative of aerial landscape imagery. That's good. Divided into visually distinct segments filled with natural materials such as dried lentils, seeds, moss and wood slices, pine needles and fibrous materials, it creates a patchwork-like terrain. The textural contrast mimics agricultural fields or geological formations when observed from a height. So obviously, without any other instruction, the AI has seen that this is what I'm trying to depict, is that landscape and the imagery that would be created if you were viewing that kind of a landscape from above. So I'm very pleased with that first part of the analysis. Looking now at line, the curved and radial lines within the segmented pie-like format guide the viewer's eye from the centre to the edge and back. What I like about making a circular design that is obviously circular in its nature, and often we don't get the opportunity to do that in terms of the way our work is judged, is that it does encourage you to keep looking at the design. If you stick within the framework of the circle, there's no way that your eye is going to be taken out of the design and away from the design. So I think what helps is that the cloud formations bring you back into the design as well. So there are things that draw you to parts of the design, but they're all part of an overall framework. You look at texture now, strongly emphasised throughout with rough seed pods, smooth wood slices, fibrous wool and soft moss to create tactile richness. There is a lot of texture in this design, and that is something that I like to focus on. There's probably, if I look at it critically, there's probably not enough obvious smooth texture or shiny texture in the design, and so I'd probably look at that as something that I would emphasise. It's there in the typha and the green strips, but not as much as I would like it to be, let's put it that way. Colour, predominantly earthy tones of browns, tans, greens and yellows, which evoke a natural grounded aesthetic. So obviously I kept in the colour palette of what you would see if the drone was going over an agricultural landscape, and that helps with the texture and the interpretation of the theme. Shape and form. The circle creates unity and wholeness, reinforced by the internal pie section layout. So it is, I think, reinforcing, and certainly because I've got some circular elements within that design. So I've got the wood slices and I've got the smaller stick slices and the Banksia flowers that are sliced up to give you that circular format. So it repeats that form and it gives you an idea that you should stay within that circular area. The only very obvious straight lines are the type of foliage, and it's broken up by the cloud formation that is above it, so it's not as dominant or as contrasting in terms of form and shape as the rest of the design. Space. Positive space is densely filled in most segments with just enough relief by the white fibrous areas to prevent overcrowding. When I first looked at this image, having not looked at it for a number of years, I felt that it was too densely packed. I think that there needs to be a little bit of, there is space obviously where the Typha rows are, and so you can see the black in between. I think that where the moss is, the grey part of it, needed to be a little bit more airy, a little bit lighter, and I think that the Banksia section needed to have a little bit more space or a little bit more variety in that as well, just to give your eyes a little bit of rest time and to provide some negative space within the design, because really the only negative space in the design is the space underneath the clouds and between the clouds. And I think it needs just a little bit more in the base area to make it a more complete design. Balance. Asymmetrical balance is achieved through the strategic placement of texture and colour across the segments. It is a balanced design. When you look at it, it is a balanced design. I think perhaps the cloud formations could be a little bit less obvious, and maybe that's just spreading out a little bit more so you can actually see through them rather than there being these dense white shapes in your face, so to speak. Rhythm, created through repetition of forms, seed groupings, line textures, and transitions from one section to the next. So in between the sections, I've actually got some dried swordgrass, so it gives me a good long straight line, and I could have that across all of the sections to segment the sections, and it needed those barriers between each of the areas to create the idea of the landscape that we were viewing from the drone above. But the repetition of those elements, and to some extent the colour palette, creates that rhythm within the design. Contrast is achieved through texture, smooth versus rough, colour, light versus dark, and density, dense versus airy sections. And I think, as I've said, that I think the contrast in terms of density is not really there, or it's not there as well as it could be, and that's one of the areas that I would improve on this design next time around. Unity. Despite varied textures, the consistency of natural elements and the circular form bring harmony. So this is what I said right at the beginning, is that circular form gives us the opportunity to unify a design within that circle, and so it makes it a little bit easier in terms of our interpretation to make it unified and harmonious by keeping within that circle and then repeating that outside circular form with something that is inside the design as well. Emphasis. The eye is naturally drawn to the white fibrous sections which form a flowing shape across the centre, suggesting movement or cloud. So it obviously felt in the end that they were clouds. It's a little bit hard to see obviously from the image because you don't get the shadow or the sense of depth that you would if you were viewing it in person. But the emphasis, I think, is, I would like the emphasis to not be on the clouds. I would like the emphasis to be on the base structure, because that was what was being viewed from above. You know, the clouds were just something to give me a little bit more depth in the design. So I think probably spacing those cloud structures out a little bit more in terms of having some space within them, so that between the materials, so that you could see through them, would help with the interpretation, as well as the emphasis being more on the base design than on the clouds themselves. But let's now have a look at some suggestions to consider when redoing this design. First of all, consider slightly reducing the size of the white fibrous areas or embedding them more subtly to allow other textures to shine equally. So exactly what I said, that they need to be spread out more in terms of having some space within them, not make the shapes bigger, make the shapes less dense in terms of the material that's used there. Number 2 is the wood slices on the far right feel slightly disconnected. Consider blending their edge or overlapping materials to soften the transitions. I think they are a little bit too dominant in that section, and perhaps what I should have done is incorporated them into the section where the Banksia foliage is, 1 or 2 of them, and then repeated some of the Banksia foliage in that section where all of the wood slices are, just to bring them together a bit more, and as it says, to soften the transitions. So overlap those 2 sections a little bit more and incorporate them a little bit better. And number 3, introduce a small vertical relief. Now, the way I wanted to get depth in this design was through the clouds, as I said, and so they're raised a little bit above, probably about 2 inches or so above the base format of the design. But I think there is opportunity there for me to have something that created a little bit more height as well, and so I'd probably look at it being where the moss is, the grey, the dried moss, the grey material. If I had that more undulating, or I had it coming at one point and rolling down, so it was a little bit more like a rolling hills landscape, because it would be very rare for you to ride across a countryside where there wasn't some sort of undulation in the landscape. And so I think that's what I've missed in this design, and so I agree with that. I think that I need that vertical relief in some fashion within this design to give it a little bit more depth and a little bit more interest without detracting from what is already there. So there you have the analysis through our AI Design Eye of this particular design. You can have your own designs analysed. You just go to the website, follow the instructions there. It takes about 24 to 48 hours, because it is also looked at by a human judge, just to make sure that the suggestions and the wording and particularly the plant materials make sense to you, so it will help you in your floral art journey. I wish you well on that journey, and I will see you next time. For now, I'm Kim Bailey. This is Floral Art Review.